Story 1. Lettuce and Roman Sleep Rituals. You are walking down a stone-paved alleyway in the late hours of a Roman evening. The sun has long vanished behind the tiled roofs of tenement buildings, and the city, though never truly silent, enters a softer rhythm. Oil lamps sputter quietly in alcoves. The clatter of sandals on stone gives way to the gentle sound of water being poured into basins, the muffled scraping of plates, and the faint creak of wooden shutters. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs into the night air. Another murmurs a brief prayer to Somnus, the god of sleep. But you, like many others in the Roman Empire, are not yet asleep. Sleep for the Romans was never taken for granted. Even in a society built on order, discipline, and routine, the body did not always obey the call to rest. Soldiers, laborers, scribes, and noblewomen alike faced sleeplessness. The causes were many: overindulgence in wine, digestive trouble from heavy feasts, noisy neighbors, troubled thoughts, lingering illnesses, or the simple weight of daily life in a crowded, unpredictable world. And so, the ancients searched for remedies. Among the most peculiar and most enduring was a plant you would scarcely think twice about today: lettuce. Lettuce as medicine. To the modern mind, lettuce is food at best, a salad base. But in ancient Rome, lettuce was medicine, explicitly linked to sleep and the body's nightly rhythms. The lactuca sativa, from which the English word lettuce is derived, played a far more prominent role in antiquity than its current station on sandwich platters might suggest. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and encyclopedist, gave the plant his approval in Natural History, Book XIX, writing, "Lettuce has a cooling effect on the body and promotes rest." Galen, the famed physician of Pergamon, advised its consumption before bed, particularly boiled and lightly seasoned. According to Galen, lettuce produces mild sleep, without heaviness of head. But it wasn't just doctors who gave lettuce its drowsy stamp of approval. It was a common understanding across Roman society, found in folk wisdom, domestic routines, and agricultural guides. From garden to table. A typical Roman domus or urban house often featured a small garden space known as the hortus. In these modest plots grew herbs, onions, leeks, and yes, lettuce. The plant's cultivation was so widespread that it became almost invisible. It required little space, responded well to irrigation, and could be harvested quickly. Varieties included the narrow-leafed wild lettuce and the broader cultivated forms. Farmers and home gardeners alike recognized its milky sap, lactuca, being a reference to lac, or milk. This sap, sticky and slightly bitter, was thought to carry sedative properties. Physicians sometimes extracted it and combined it with vinegar or rose water to apply as a balm. Others recommended the raw sap in small doses for calming an agitated mind. There are even accounts of lettuce juice being infused into wine or honey mixtures, though these combinations remained rare and, frankly, unpalatable. It was far more common and acceptable to simply eat it. In villas and apartments alike, lettuce was boiled before bed. The hot water softened its bitterness, and a bit of olive oil, vinegar, or garum, a fermented fish sauce, might be added. It was served plain, often in silence. A dish of boiled lettuce at the end of an evening meal might seem dull, but in Rome that was precisely the point. Heavy, spicy, or exciting food was thought to stimulate the body and spirit. Lettuce, by contrast, calmed it. Sleep as discipline. To understand why lettuce came to be so revered as a sleep aid, one must understand Roman attitudes toward sleep itself. In Roman thought, sleep was both necessary and vulnerable. It was considered a restorative state, but also a moment of weakness. Philosophers wrote of the soul leaving the body in dreams. Soldiers were trained to resist drowsiness on watch. To sleep too much was to invite moral decay, but to sleep too little was to risk one's health. Cato the Elder, that ever-stern senator, advised moderation even in sleep. "Sleep is not an indulgence," he wrote, "but a function like eating or breathing." In elite households, sleep schedules were regulated, and nighttime routines were observed carefully. Baths, Light meals, prayer, and yes, lettuce formed a sequence meant to coax the body into rest without excess. It is worth noting that elite Romans often didn't sleep through the night in one uninterrupted block. Many practiced segmented sleep, two shorter sleep periods separated by a wakeful hour, during which letters were written, wine was taken, or short walks around the peristyle were made. In this context, the soothing properties of lettuce made it more than just food. It became part of the architecture of sleep. Emperors and lettuce. Even emperors were not immune to the allure of a sleepy salad. The Emperor Augustus, known for his temperance and methodical routines, reportedly ate a dish of lettuce each night before retiring. Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, mentions Augustus' careful dietary habits and notes that his physicians advised against stimulants. Lettuce was not merely tolerated, it was encouraged. Whether this habit truly improved his sleep is unknown, but it became part of his image, the calm, rational ruler who lived in accordance with nature's rhythms. Claudius, on the other hand, once fell ill after consuming too much lettuce. The ancient sources disagree. Was it the lettuce itself or something with it? In either case, the plant's strong association with the gut, both calming and irritating, suggests that its effects were not always predictable. Still, it remained part of the Roman pharmacopoeia, sometimes chewed raw to soothe ulcers, other times simmered with herbs for digestive comfort. Lettuce and dreams. There's a deeper question at the heart of the Roman lettuce obsession. Was it really about sleep, or about the idea of control? In a world without artificial light, where fire was dangerous and street lamps scarce, the night held its own kind of power. Strange dreams, unexpected visitors, sudden fevers all came after the lamps were snuffed. To take a step towards sleep was, in some sense, to surrender. Perhaps the lettuce ritual gave Romans a small illusion of order over that nightly chaos. Roman dream interpretation, oniromancy, was a thriving practice. Artemidorus of Daldes compiled volumes interpreting dreams, from visions of birds to falling teeth. But the interpretation of lettuce in dreams was particularly peculiar. To dream of lettuce, Artemidorus wrote, meant upcoming illness or minor pain. Why? Perhaps because lettuce was associated with the body in decline, the winding down of the day, the slowing of systems. And yet people continued to eat it, every night, for centuries. The common sleep ritual. For the average Roman, not a philosopher or emperor, but a cobbler, cook, or mule driver, the lettuce ritual was simple. Boil water. Wash the leaves. Simmer gently. Strain. Season lightly. Eat slowly without distraction. Lie down. There were no sleep apps, no pills, no weighted blankets, just the bitter taste of boiled greens, the soft sigh of a bed made from straw, and the hope that rest would come quietly and stay until dawn. Historical curiosity or real sedative. Now we must ask, did lettuce actually work? Did it have real sedative properties, or was its power purely psychological? Modern studies on lettuce, particularly the white sap known as lactucarium, suggest mild analgesic and sedative effects. Some varieties, particularly wild lettuces like Lactuca virosa, contain compounds similar to opiates, though far weaker. These effects would be minimal in cultivated Roman lettuce, but possibly noticeable when eaten regularly or in concentrated forms. Still, the actual biochemical power of lettuce may matter less than its ritual function. In consuming it nightly, in associating it with calm and silence, Romans likely trained themselves to sleep. Much like modern sleep hygiene, the act of winding down with dim light, quiet, and routine, the lettuce ritual gave structure to the descent into slumber. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even particularly tasty, but in a noisy, unpredictable empire, it offered something precious, the promise of rest. Ending thought. Was it truly the plant that brought sleep to the Romans, or was it the belief in the ritual itself, the power of repetition, the slow rhythm of a body taught to relax by a simple, bitter leaf? You are lying on a wooden frame bed in a Roman insula, a multi-story apartment complex common in the heart of Rome. The city has slipped into evening, but true silence is a fiction. Somewhere in the street below, a drunk stumbles home, singing off-key. In the unit beside you, a child wails. Further away, a dog barks once, then again. There is no glass in the windows, only thin wooden shutters. The world seeps in. Still, your body is heavy from a modest supper of lentils, barley bread, and the customary bowl of boiled lettuce. You've blown out your oil lamp and pulled a wool blanket over your chest. The bed creaks slightly. You wait. And wait. Sleep, for many Romans, remained elusive even after the lettuce. Segmented sleep, a forgotten rhythm. Today, we tend to expect sleep to arrive in a solid 8-hour stretch, but this was not the Roman way. Across Mediterranean cultures, the night was divided, with Romans practicing what historians now call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. This rhythm consisted of first sleep, prima somni, typically lasting from shortly after nightfall until midnight, followed by a wakeful interval, and then second sleep, secunda somni, continuing until dawn. During this midnight interval, Romans would often wake up fully. They might light a lamp, pray to household gods, drink watered wine, or even engage in quiet labor such as spinning wool or reviewing account scrolls. This wakefulness was not seen as insomnia, but as a natural break, one that could last anywhere from 30 minutes to over an hour. Lettuce may have helped them reach the first sleep, but after waking, the challenge was in returning to the second. The noises of night. While the Roman day was bustling, the night carried its own set of persistent sounds, subtler, but often more disturbing for the light sleeper. Wooden carts rattled down streets even after sunset, especially in busy urban centers like Rome or Ostia. Commercial deliveries were restricted during the day to reduce congestion, forcing tradespeople to move goods at night. This included bakers, fishmongers, and textile dyers, all making noise with wooden wheels, loud voices, and the shuffling of beasts of burden. Public slaves, known as nocturni, patrolled the streets. Tasked with watching for fires, crime, or disturbances, they often called out warnings or reported trouble in groups, waking sleeping residents with their voices. Taverns or popani often continued to operate well past dusk. While considered disreputable by the upper classes, they were vital gathering places for the working poor. Drunken singing, gambling disputes, and sudden fights were not uncommon. Animals, too, contributed. Chickens were kept on rooftops, dogs roamed alleys. Even cats, semi-domesticated and often associated with temples, might cry into the dark. Finally, there was the matter of plumbing. Roman water systems were wonders of engineering, but aqueduct-fed lead pipes were not silent. Water gurgled, leaked, and knocked through the walls of buildings, especially in the middle of the night when usage dropped and pressure shifted. The world did not grow silent after dark, it simply changed key. The gods of the night. To cope with sleeplessness, Romans often turned to ritual and religion. The household gods, or Lares and Penates, were honored before bed with whispered prayers or offerings of oil. If restlessness persisted, more focused appeals might be made to lesser-known deities. Somnus, the god of sleep, son of night Nox and brother to death Mors. Shrines to Somnus were rare, but he was often invoked in poetry and charms. Morpheus, a dream spirit in the house of Somnus, believed to shape dreams and deliver divine messages. Febris, a goddess of fever, sometimes invoked when insomnia was linked to physical illness. Sauranus, a chthonic deity worshipped by night, especially by shepherds and rural folk, believed to protect travelers and wanderers. But worship was not always lofty. Many Romans turned to amulets, spells, and household charms. Some inscribed lead tablets depictions with appeals for peace or revenge, burying them in courtyards or under beds. Others burned herbs like bay leaves, rosemary, or wormwood, believing the smoke would chase bad dreams. A common charm involved binding a sprig of poppy under one's bed or rubbing the forehead with oil infused with chamomile and vinegar. In some regions, children were given lunar-shaped pendants called lunulae, believed to ward off nightmares. Sleep was not just a biological function, it was a spiritual negotiation. The design of sleep. A Roman home, particularly among the elite, was designed with daily rhythm in mind. The placement of bedrooms, cubicula, followed predictable logic. The day bedrooms were closer to the atrium, suitable for napping or short rests during the warm afternoons. The night bedrooms, however, were deeper within the house, often windowless, quieter, and kept cool with thick walls or ventilation shafts. Beds were simple wooden frames with ropes or leather straps to support a mattress of straw or wool. Wealthier Romans added feather-stuffed cushions, dyed blankets, or animal skins. A headrest might be made from wood, ceramic, or stone, often intentionally hard, to discourage excessive softness or luxury, which were viewed with suspicion. Curtains or fabric screens were used for privacy, but walls between rooms were often thin. Servants moved at all hours, and families shared tight quarters. The wealthy might retreat to rural villas for better rest, where wind and night birds replaced the clamor of the city. Lighting was dim. Oil lamps burned olive oil, but it was expensive. So many let them go out early. Darkness, for most Romans, was a natural state, not a thing to fear, but to endure and accept. Sleep in class. As with many aspects of Roman life, sleep differed dramatically between the classes. The urban poor lived in insulae multi-story apartment buildings often made of wood and brick. These were poorly insulated, cramped, and noisy. A family might share a single room. Fires were frequent. Nights were loud. Privacy was scarce. Even in sleep, the lower classes were exposed. By contrast, the wealthy might enjoy multiple bedrooms, rural villas, sound-insulating architecture, and the luxury of controlled routines. Slaves prepared their bedding, ensured clean linens, and guarded against disturbances. Still, even in luxurious villas, sleep was not guaranteed. Cicero, in a letter, complains of insomnia due to stress and travel. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, writes of struggling to quiet his mind, buzzing like a swarm of flies. Nero, paranoid in his final days, paced hallways at night, unable to rest even under layers of linen and rose-scented oil. No one, not even emperors, could command sleep. Dangers in the dark. We often think of sleep as safe, but in Rome, night was dangerous. Fires were a constant threat. With open flames used for cooking, heat, and light, buildings frequently caught fire. Watchmen patrolled, but few buildings had fire suppression systems. Burglars and thieves operated under cover of night, especially in dense urban centers. The absence of reliable policing meant that homes relied on dogs, slaves, or simple wooden locks for protection. Night air, or air nocturnus, was thought to carry illness. Roman medical theory, especially under Galenic influence, warned that the body was more susceptible to miasma at night. This was partly why sleeping with open windows was avoided. And then there were nightmares, not just dreams, but supernatural visitations. Some believed spirits or demons, lemures or larvae, entered through the mouth or nose during sleep. Protective incantations were whispered. Doors were sealed with chalk symbols. Sleep in this world was vulnerability. Let us revisit it. In light of all this, the lettuce at bedtime gains new meaning. It was not simply a dietary recommendation. It was a ritual shield, a way to ease into the mystery of night with something familiar and bodily. To eat lettuce before bed was to announce to oneself and one's household, the day is over. I have done my duty. I am preparing to surrender. And for those who managed to sleep fully, without disturbance or fear, it was a small triumph of routine over chaos. Ending thought. When a Roman closed their eyes each night, they entered a world both sacred and perilous. But even with dreams of demons, bursts of noise, and the midnight chill of a stone floor, was sleep ever truly more fragile than it is today? Imagine now the passing of centuries. The Roman lamps dim and vanish. The cubicula fall silent. Stone walls collapse into earth. A once orderly world slowly unwinds. But in the kitchens of medieval Europe, vegetables still simmer. In monasteries, herbs are still sorted. Somewhere, a man boils greens for supper, perhaps with no knowledge that, long ago, Romans ate the same for sleep. The ritual, the belief, the association between lettuce and sleep did not end in an instant. It faded gradually, absorbed into newer frameworks of medicine, religion, and changing daily life. This final chapter traces that fading, how the mighty Roman Empire, with its sleep philosophies and midnight lettuce bowls, gave way to new paradigms, and how the idea of sleep itself evolved beyond Roman boundaries. The afterglow of Roman thought. The Roman Empire formally collapsed in the West in 476 CE, but its influence lingered like twilight after sunset. Medical ideas, texts, and agricultural practices survived through scribes and scholars. Galen's writings were copied in Greek and Latin, and his views on sleep, including lettuce's role in promoting it, were preserved in monastic libraries. Early Christian physicians, such as Oribasius and Aetius of Amida, quoted Galen almost reverently. Yet lettuce was no longer just a Roman remedy. In medieval herbals, particularly those circulating in the Carolingian and Islamic worlds, lettuce appeared as a cooling plant used to calm the stomach and reduce fevers. Its link to sleep was still present but less emphasized. Physica, a 12th century natural science book by Hildegard of Bingen, mentions lettuce's properties. She writes, "Lettuce is cold, and when eaten, it tempers the passions and lulls the soul." This echoes Roman sentiment, but the framing is spiritual now, not medical. It soothes not just the belly but the soul. Sleep, in Hildegard's world, was moral rest, not bodily surrender. This transition from empirical to spiritual thinking would shape the plant's reputation for centuries. The rise of monastic sleep routines. In the early Middle Ages, Christian monasticism brought a new relationship to sleep. Where Roman citizens sought calm for comfort or productivity, monks saw sleep as a temptation to resist. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, structured sleep as a necessity but one strictly controlled. Monks awoke for matins, the night prayer, often around 2 or 3 a.m. This mirrored the Roman first sleep, second sleep structure, though now reframed through religious obligation. And yet monastic meals were simple and often included vegetables. The lettuce persisted. In the gardens of monasteries from Monte Cassino to Cluny, it grew alongside sage, rue, garlic, and other staples. The monks may not have eaten it specifically for sleep, but they maintained its cultivation, harvesting it fresh each evening. In that sense, though the lettuce lost its name as a sleep aid, it remained part of the rhythm of lives dedicated to silence, order, and the regular turning of the day into night. The transformation of medical theory. During the Islamic Golden Age, 8th to 13th centuries, Roman medical knowledge was translated, critiqued, and expanded by scholars like Avicenna and Rhazes. In the canon of medicine, Avicenna references lettuce as a cold and moist plant, again linking it to calming properties. He notes that lettuce reduces sexual desire, quenches thirst, and induces sleep, a clear echo of Galenic categorization. But he also warns, lettuce in excess causes forgetfulness. This is a new twist. Where Romans saw the plant as sleep-inducing and mildly medicinal, later Islamic and European physicians began to frame it as potentially dulling not just of the senses, but of the mind. As medicine moved toward balance theory and humoral psychology, lettuce became a double-edged leaf. Its cooling property was good for those with fiery temperaments, but dangerous for the melancholic or phlegmatic. By the time these ideas filtered into late medieval Europe, lettuce was still on the table but no longer associated clearly with sleep. It had become just another vegetable with a complicated personality. The night changes. Across the centuries, sleep itself changed. With the rise of towns in the High Middle Ages and later the introduction of artificial light candles, torches, eventually lanterns, night became a more active period. Artisans worked late. Night watchmen patrolled city walls. Inns remained open longer. Segmented sleep remained the norm through much of this time, but the rituals of sleep became looser. The growing complexity of urban life introduced more night noise, less predictability, and perhaps less control. By the time we reach the Renaissance, sleep was more flexible, more individual. There are fewer records of bedtime rituals involving plants or dietary habits, and more mentions of beds, mattresses, curtains, and chambers designed to enhance rest by separating the sleeper from the world. Lettuce still present, still eaten, still boiled or served with vinegar, but the memory of it as a sleep food was eroding. Lettuce in the modern age. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Western medicine became increasingly skeptical of herbal remedies, unless they could be studied, classified, and extracted. In 1799, scientists in Britain began investigating the sap of wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, claiming it had opiate-like effects. A substance known as lactucarium was isolated and sold as lettuce opium. Apothecaries offered it as a mild sedative or pain reliever. But it never became a mainstream drug. Its effects were too mild, too inconsistent. When morphine and other alkaloids emerged from the opium poppy, lettuce faded from the pharmaceutical spotlight. By the 20th century, lettuce was culinary only. Iceberg, romaine, butterhead, crisfed. It filled sandwiches, side salads, and grocery bins, but never medicine cabinets. The image of Romans boiling lettuce before bed would have seemed quaint, or even absurd. Sleep today, sleep then. Today we approach sleep with science, supplements, screens, and strategies. Sleep hygiene, circadian rhythm charts, blue light filters, sleep apps, smart mattresses. And yet, insomnia remains as stubborn as ever. In many ways, the Roman approach with its mixture of routine, belief, environment, and simple food was not that different. They understood what modern researchers confirm, that sleep is sensitive. It needs preparation, consistency, and gentle cues. The lettuce, bitter and soft, was never a miracle, but it was a signal, a way to say, now begins the quiet, and that perhaps was its greatest power. Coda, the modern revival. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in natural sleep aids, herbal teas, chamomile, lavender, melatonin-rich foods. And quietly, in corners of the wellness world, lettuce tea has reemerged. Boiled lettuce leaves steeped in hot water, strained, sipped slowly. You'll find it on YouTube and herbalist blogs on TikTok. Some claim it works, others scoff. But in either case, the idea is not new. It is ancient, 2,000 years old, in fact. A ritual once performed under Roman lamplight, reborn under LED. Final reflection. The Romans did not need to conquer sleep. They merely invited it with boiled greens, dim light, and the repetition of ritual. And perhaps that's what we've lost. Not the secret ingredient, but the slowness, the belief, the surrender. The lettuce never promised dreams, only a quieter descent into the mystery of night. Story 2. The silent builders of Roman roads. Beneath the clatter of legionnaire boots, under the wheels of ox carts and chariots, past the dust kicked up by merchants and messengers, there was always stone. Quiet, patient stone. The Roman road is among the most celebrated infrastructural achievements in human history. But what you rarely hear about, what's almost never carved into triumphal arches or praised in senatorial decrees, is who built them and how. This story is not about generals mapping out conquests or senators commissioning routes. It is about the men and sometimes women whose labor turned soil and gravel into a continent-spanning highway. Those whose names are lost, who left behind no memoirs, no statues, and no epitaphs. Only the flattened stones beneath your feet. In this section, we'll journey into their world. The daily routines of Roman road crews, their tools, their food, the orders they followed, and the lives they lived on the literal edge of empire. Let us begin where most Romans did with distance. All roads lead to Rome. Rome's roads weren't just about travel, they were about control. At its peak, the empire maintained over 400,000 kilometers of roads, including nearly 80,000 kilometers of paved highways. Roads connected Rome to the Alps, Gaul to Britannia, Antioch to Egypt. The famous Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, stretched over 500 kilometers from Rome to Brindisi. It became the model for every road that followed. But the genius of Roman roads lay not only in their design but in their standardization. Distances were measured from the Milliarium Aureum, the golden milestone in the Roman Forum. From that point, roads extended in every direction, and all travelers, civilian or soldier, knew exactly how far they were from the capital. Building these roads was an effort of precise repetition. And at the heart of this labor was a workforce drawn not from the aristocracy, but from the invisible classes of Rome. Who built the roads? The builders of Rome's roads were rarely free men seeking profit. They were slaves owned by the state or rented by contractors, convicts sentenced to public labor, soldiers, especially engineers of the legions, local laborers, sometimes conscripted from conquered territories, manual craftsmen, part of mobile teams under military supervision. The army's engineers, the architecti, agrimensors, and librators surveyed and mapped, but the earth-moving, stone hauling, and tamping was left to others. Many were assigned tasks without any form of compensation. Those who were paid earned a daily ration or a few coins, rarely enough to save or invest. Their reward was survival. And so tens of thousands of hands labored across the empire, digging, hauling, measuring, laying, without fanfare, without credit. How a road was made. If you imagined a Roman road as a simple stone path, the reality is far more layered. Each road, depending on its location and importance, followed a multi-stage construction process. Surveying. The road's path was carefully marked by a grammaticus using the groma, a T-shaped surveying tool. The groma ensured that roads ran in straight lines as often as possible, even through difficult terrain. Excavation. A trench up to 1.5 meters deep was dug. Laborers used picks, shovels, and baskets to remove soil, all without mechanical help. The sides of the trench were tamped and reinforced with clay. Layering. A Roman road typically had 4 to 5 layers. Statumen, a base of large stones for drainage. Rudis, a mix of gravel and lime pounded into place. Nucleus, finer gravel and sand tamped smooth. Summum dorsum, the top layer paving stones or large flat slabs. In wealthier provinces or near cities, the top layer would be tightly fitted polygonal stones. In rural areas, it might be packed gravel. Camber and ditches. Roads were built with a slight arch the camber to allow rainwater to run off. Ditches flanked each side, dug by hand to channel water and mark the road's edge. Mile markers and rest stations. Stone markers were placed at regular intervals 1 Roman mile, about 1,480 meters, noting the distance from Rome and sometimes the name of the magistrate who commissioned the work. Mutatio, relay stations, and mansio, lodging houses, were built at intervals, offering respite for travelers, but not necessarily for the workers who built them. Each of these stages was exhausting, repetitive, and often thankless. Tools of the trade. The Roman road crew used primitive but effective tools. Pickaxes dalabra to break stone. Shovels made from wood and iron for moving earth. Rammers pilum to pound layers down. Wooden frames to level the road surface. Measuring rods and plumb lines to maintain straightness. There were no machines, no cranes, no trucks. Only muscle, discipline, and relentless work under a punishing sun or freezing rain. Even gravel had to be quarried, loaded onto wagons and transported, often from miles away. A single kilometer of road could take weeks to build, depending on terrain and weather. A day in the life of a road laborer. You wake before dawn, rolled in a worn wool blanket, surrounded by others under a makeshift canvas tent. A centurion shouts. You rise, wash your face in a shared basin, and eat a bowl of porridge barley or spelt with perhaps a dried fig. You lift a shovel, you begin to dig. Hours pass, dirt is piled, rocks are heaved, dust clings to your skin, your hands blister. At midday, a short break. You eat cold bread dipped in oil, drink watered wine from a shared skin, then back to work. In the afternoon, you tamp gravel until your shoulders ache. Someone curses, someone else drops from heat. You keep going. At dusk, you collapse near a fire, your body shaking. Tomorrow it begins again. You are building something you may never walk on, something for merchants, soldiers, emperors. You are anonymous, but the road remains. Road builders as instruments of empire. It is easy to forget that Rome's roads were not just for travel, they were for domination. They allowed the legions to move rapidly. They allowed tax collectors to extract revenue. They enabled governors to enforce laws. They brought grain to cities, troops to revolts, and prisoners to Rome. Every stone laid was a tool of empire. The workers may not have thought in these terms. They had no say in imperial policy, but they were part of a machine spreading the influence of Rome, kilometer by kilometer. Their sweat lubricated the empire. Death along the road. The work was dangerous. Digging ditches and laying stones meant injuries, disease, and exposure. There were no labor unions, no medical leave. If a worker died, he was replaced. If a slave faltered, he might be beaten. If a convict collapsed, the overseers simply shouted louder. Occasionally, mass graves have been found near ancient road sites, unceremonious pits of bones, poorly buried, names unknown. And yet the roads were praised. The magistrates who ordered them immortalized in inscriptions. The emperors who funded them honored on coins. The men who built them forgotten. Except for the stones. Ending thought. When we say all roads lead to Rome, do we think of the emperors who planned them or the calloused hands that built them, stone by stone, into the quiet permanence of history? By the time the sun rose on a Roman day, the roads were already alive. Couriers galloped on horseback, trailing dust and urgency. Soldiers marched in formation, armor clinking in time with sandals. Merchants pulled carts of amphorae, linen, and salted fish. Pilgrims walked barefoot. Oxen strained against loads of marble and grain. From every part of the empire, they came along the roads that tied the world to Rome. What the builders had left behind was not a simple highway, but a living system. Roads were more than paths, they were arteries, pulsing with movement, control, commerce, and information. In this section, we'll follow those who used the Roman roads, the merchants, the legions, the bureaucrats, and the ordinary travelers who trusted their feet to stones laid by hands they would never know. The official travelers. The fastest and most privileged travelers on Roman roads were those on official business couriers, diplomats, and high-ranking administrators. To move efficiently across vast distances, the Roman state developed the cursus publicus, or public post system. Established under Augustus and refined over time, it was the logistical backbone of empire-wide communication. Relay stations, mutations, were placed roughly every 12-20 miles. Here, Messengers could swap exhausted horses for fresh ones. Lodging stations, mansions, provided accommodations for imperial officials, complete with food, beds, and stables. Couriers carried diplomatic letters, military orders, or even verbal instructions known only to the messenger. These envoys bore leather cases, sometimes sealed with wax, and traveled under imperial authority. No tolls, no delays. Armed with diplomatic exemption, they could demand food, rest, and horses from any station. Most carried a diploma, a folded and sealed passport issued by the emperor or a governor. Woe to anyone who obstructed their path. The roads, in their case, were not destinations, they were promises of speed, precision, and control. The soldiers. Every empire has its legs, and Rome were clad in caligy hobnailed military boots. The Roman legions moved across the empire on foot, often traveling 15-20 miles per day, sometimes more. Roman roads, built wide and flat, allowed for disciplined columns of soldiers to march efficiently, even while carrying heavy packs. Legionaries often carried shields and weapons, gladius pilum dagger, armor lyrica segmentata or chainmail, cooking pots, rations, and personal items, 2 stakes suits for building nightly camps. Roadside mile markers told them how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The Via Egnatia, for instance, carried troops from the Adriatic to Byzantium. The Via Claudia Augusta brought reinforcements through the Alps. During military campaigns, engineers advanced ahead, repairing damaged roads or clearing debris. The road was not just a convenience, it was a strategic necessity. Rapid movement of troops meant faster suppression of rebellions, quicker border defense, and more efficient governance of distant provinces. A Roman general without a road was like a ship without sails. The merchants. Not every traveler was draped in official garb or iron armor. Most were merchants, plying their trades across the sprawling networks of Roman commerce. They transported wine from Campania, olive oil from Hispania, salted fish from Numidia, glassware from Syria, linen from Egypt, pottery from Gaul, spices from the east, arriving via maritime ports. Carts creaked along with wooden wheels reinforced in metal. Where roads permitted, 2-wheeled carts were preferred for speed. In more rugged areas, 4-wheeled wagons provided stability. Carts were often pulled by oxen, slow but sturdy. Horses were faster but costlier and required better roads. In mountainous regions, mules or human porters did the work. Tolls and tariffs were collected at road checkpoints, especially near cities and bridges. These were called portoria, and they funded road maintenance or, occasionally, the local magistrate's pocket. Merchants often traveled in convoys for safety, especially in remote areas where bandits might roam. Small inns and farmsteads offered places to rest, eat, and stable animals. Roman roads allowed merchants to calculate journeys, predict supply times, and expand markets. For the first time in ancient Europe, logistics had become predictable. The ordinary traveler. And then there were the others, the nameless, the ordinary, the tired. Pilgrims walking to shrines, like the temple of Asclepius. Women visiting family in distant towns. Students traveling to Alexandria or Athens for study. Beggars seeking alms at city gates. Freed slaves returning to their native provinces. Soldiers, wives, and children following regiments. These travelers walked on foot with little protection. They carried small sacks, water flasks, and perhaps a spare tunic. They slept in the open or under trees. The journey was long, painful, uncertain. Few could afford to ride, and even fewer had the right to use the cursus publicus. For them, the roads offered possibility, not comfort. They read milestones with wonder, seeing names of cities they might never reach. Hazards and challenges. Roman roads were durable but not perfect. Traveling them carried real risks. Banditry, especially in forested or mountainous areas, gangs might ambush travelers. Weather, heavy rain could wash out sections of road or flood river crossings. Disease, travelers risked infection from crowded inns or exposure. Fatigue, with no paved sidewalks, feet blistered quickly. Even sandals could wear through. Despite their sturdiness, roads degraded over time. Sections cracked, stones shifted, weeds grew between layers. In rural regions, neglected roads turned back into paths. Though maintenance crews existed, often managed by local magistrates or private contractors, their reach was limited. Some roads were repaired only when needed for military or political reasons. Travelers learned to trust landmarks, ask locals, and prepare for detours. Maps, milestones, and measurement. How did a Roman traveler know where to go? Maps were rare and expensive. The best-known example is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman road map. It stretched 6.75 meters long and showed roads, cities, and distances, but was not scaled to geography. More useful were itineraria, lists of routes, distances, and stopovers, carried like pocket books. Milestones, carved stone columns placed every Roman mile, ~1, 480 meters. These noted the distance from Rome, local cities, and sometimes the name of the current emperor. Guideposts, in cities and major intersections, painted or carved signs pointed to destinations. Wealthy travelers hired guides or local interpreters, while others relied on word of mouth. Travelers shared stories about rough roads, safe rest stops, generous hosts, or recent dangers. The road network became a shared knowledge base, passed in fragments from foot to foot. Cultural exchange on the road. As people moved, so did ideas. A soldier from Gaul might pick up a new style of sandal in Cappadocia. A merchant from Syria might learn Latin curses in a Roman tavern. An Egyptian priest might walk past a Druid shrine on his way to deliver papyri to a provincial library. These roads were not just channels of goods, but beliefs, languages, and stories. Inscriptions left by travelers on stones and temple walls tell us of hopes, losses, miracles, and prayers. One might read, "Marcus walked to Neapolis. The gods favored him. May they favor me." Another simply, "I reached home." These are the echoes not of emperors, but of feet. Ending thought. The Roman roads carried emperors, legions, and laws, but also quiet lives, worn sandals, whispered hopes. If you had walked them centuries ago, would your story have made it into the marble histories or only into the dust between stones? The world that built the Roman roads eventually fell quiet. The emperors died, the legions dispersed, the milestones weathered, but the roads, those long, deliberate lines cut into Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, remained. They no longer echoed with imperial orders or diplomatic urgency. Instead, they became paths for pilgrims, for fugitives, for monks and traders, shepherds and wanderers. The Roman road network, though cracked and broken in places, did not disappear. It transformed, adapted to new empires, new beliefs, and new purposes. This final section is not about the making of roads, or even their golden era of traffic. It's about what happened after the builders were gone. The empire crumbles. In the 5th century CE, as Rome's political control fractured, so too did the infrastructure that had held the empire together. The Western Roman Empire collapsed under pressure from internal decay and external invasions. The great roads, once maintained by organized imperial administrators, began to fall into disrepair. With fewer resources, provinces focused on local needs. Road maintenance was no longer a priority. Bridges rotted, ditches clogged, weeds split the paving stones. But despite the decline of centralized maintenance, the roads remained passable. In many places, they continued to be the best routes available. Local kings, bishops, and warlords used them for travel and military campaigns, just as Roman governors had. Old milestones were sometimes removed, repurposed as building material or crosses. Others were left in place, slowly swallowed by moss. Roads of the Church. As Roman institutions faded, the Christian Church rose. Monks and missionaries walked the same roads that legates and generals had once used. The pilgrimage movement of the early medieval period depended heavily on surviving Roman infrastructure. The Via Francigena took pilgrims from Canterbury to Rome. The Camino de Santiago in Iberia overlapped with Roman trade routes. Roads from Antioch to Jerusalem guided early religious travelers. In this way, the Roman roads became sacred veins not of empire, but of faith. Monasteries were built along the old roads, often using stones from abandoned Roman villas or forums. These new centers of stability preserved some of the road knowledge, even if they could no longer fully maintain the paths. Some monks even copied old itineraria, listing cities and distances as part of their geographic knowledge. In an age of crumbling borders, the roads were a way to orient the soul as well as the body. Medieval travelers. During the Middle Ages, travel became more dangerous. Where once travelers moved under the protection of imperial law, they now navigated a patchwork of territories, languages, and loyalties. Yet many Roman roads were still in use, though they had become narrow, worn, or partially lost to forest and field. Some roads were renamed after saints or cities. Others acquired local legends, ghost stories, miracles, or bandit tales. A once pure military route might now be called Devil's Mile or Pilgrim's Walk. Merchants continued to use major routes to connect medieval fairs, especially in France and Italy. Soldiers marched on the same stones when they answered crusade calls. Kings rode along broken roads to coronations and battles. The stones endured. Rediscovery and mapping. During the Renaissance and early modern period, antiquarians and mapmakers began to re-examine the Roman legacy. They sought out old milestones hidden in fields, remains of Roman bridges, fragments of inscriptions referencing emperors and distances. Scholars began documenting the layout of ancient Roman roads with increasing precision. In the 18th and 19th centuries, archaeological efforts uncovered paving stones buried under layers of medieval or modern paths. One of the most significant modern references is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a map showing the Roman road network from Britain to India. Though a medieval copy, it preserved knowledge of road connections long forgotten in practical use. In Britain, antiquarians traced Roman roads like Watling Street, Ermine Street, Fosse Way. These names survive on signs and maps to this day. Roads reused and reborn. As Europe industrialized in the 18th and 19th centuries, many ancient Roman routes were repurposed. Surveyors often found that Roman roads still offered the most efficient paths across landscapes. Their routes avoided floodplains, navigated valleys smartly, and climbed hills at manageable gradients. Rather than building entirely new paths, many countries chose to pave over Roman roads. This happened in Italy during the Napoleonic and Risorgimento periods, France under the ancient regime and later Napoleon, Britain during the turnpike and rail eras. In this way, the bones of Rome's roads became the spine of modern Europe's infrastructure. You can still walk on original Roman paving stones in places like the Via Appia Antica outside Rome, sections of road in Pompeii and Ostia Antica, fragments in Tarragona, Autun, and York. In each case, the stones speak not through words, but through quiet endurance. Echoes in language. Even our words preserve the memory of Roman roads. The word street comes from the Latin strada, meaning paved way. Via still means road in Italian and Spanish. The term mile comes from mil passus, 1,000 paces. Road itself stems from ridden Old English for to ride, but the concept of a fixed, durable route comes from Rome. Even the idea that all roads lead to Rome reflects not just geography, but the cultural gravity of Roman roads. They were seen as symbols of order, reach, and universality. Forgotten labor, enduring legacy. And yet, in all this celebration of endurance and design, one thing remains largely unspoken: the people who built them. The slaves, soldiers, and laborers who hauled stones, tamped gravel, and endured the weather left no records of their work. They appear only as anonymous shadows in the writings of others, or not at all. Their names are gone, their faces forgotten. But the roads they made, they remain beneath tires, boots, and shoes, carrying the weight of new lives who may never know who laid the first stone. The roads today. In the modern world, Roman roads continue to shape the places they once conquered. Tourists walk them unaware. Commuters drive on asphalt that hides ancient strata. In rural villages, shepherds still guide flocks along stone-cut paths laid 2,000 years ago. Some cities have built modern bike paths beside ancient Roman roads, aligning contemporary life with ancient geometry. Archaeologists continue to uncover forgotten segments in forests, fields, and under modern construction sites. Each rediscovery is a small restoration of forgotten labor. And sometimes a milestone is found buried, still intact, the name of an emperor still visible, the road still pointing forward. Classical final reflection. Rome's roads were not built in marble, they were built in silence by calloused hands, patient backs, and unseen effort. They do not glitter, they do not speak, but they remain. So the next time you follow a road straight, deliberate, strangely enduring, pause. Look down, listen to the stone. It remembers. Salt Story 3. Salt as empire's foundation. Salt, ordinary, granular, white. It pours easily from your fingers, sticks to sweat, and stings a wound. It flavors the bland and preserves the perishable. Today it's found in plastic shakers, snack foods, and nearly every kitchen cabinet. But for the Romans, salt was far more than seasoning. It was power. This section explores the indispensable role of salt in the Roman Empire, not as a luxury, but as a quiet, structural element of survival, economy, and control. We'll follow the forgotten trade routes that carried salt across the empire, the workers who mined and transported it, and the subtle ways it infiltrated daily life, from soldiers' rations to tax policy to the origins of the word salary. Let's begin, as Romans often did, with infrastructure. The Via Salaria, a road for salt. Long before the Caesars ruled and the Colosseum echoed with cheers, there was a road cut through the Italian landscape from the Adriatic coast to the heart of Latium. Its name, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. The Via Salaria was older than Rome, first used by the Sabines, a central Italian tribe, to transport salt from the mouth of the Tiber River inland. The route would later become a Roman consular road, paved and formalized, forming part of the empire's growing network. But even in its most primitive state, the road's name tells us what mattered most. Not gold, not marble salt. Salt from the salt pans of Ostia, where seawater was evaporated in clay basins, was carted along this route to supply communities far from the coast. Without refrigeration, salt was the only method to preserve food beyond a day or two. In the humid summers of the Italian interior, salt wasn't a luxury, it was life. And so the Romans, with typical precision, ensured its movement was protected. Salt as survival. To a Roman household, whether a senator's villa or a plebeian's cramped insula, salt was a daily necessity. Its uses were extensive. Preservation. Salt-cured meats, fish, olives, and cheeses. Garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce, required large amounts of salt to process. Hygiene. Salt was used in mouth rinses and early tooth powders. Medicine. Roman physicians prescribed salt for wounds, skin ailments, sore throats, and even digestive issues. Sacrifice. Salt was mixed with flour in religious rituals. No offering to the gods was complete without mola salsa, a salted meal. It even played a part in birth rituals, with newborns rubbed with salt to ward off evil. Salt's purifying symbolism carried into Roman religious thought and was later absorbed by Christian sacramental language. In short, salt was not an addition to Roman life, it was a pillar of it. Salt and the legions. Nowhere was salt's importance more literal or more misunderstood than in the Roman military. It's often said that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. This is not entirely accurate. Soldiers were paid in coin, but the origin of their word for pay salarium may be tied to salt allowances. The most widely accepted explanation is this. The term salarium originally referred to a stipend or allowance to buy salt. Over time, it evolved into the word for salary general wages. For a Roman soldier on campaign, salt was vital. It allowed the preservation of rations, particularly meat and fish. Supply chains in hostile territory were stretched, and salted provisions could be transported further without spoilage. A Roman legion could consume hundreds of modii, a Roman measure of volume of salt each month. Salt was loaded into carts, stored in sacks, and distributed with measured regularity, not unlike modern MREs. And unlike today, a lack of salt could cause real physical collapse. Without sodium, human bodies fail. Roman commanders understood this long before the science was formalized. To be a soldier in Rome was to march with salt. Salt and trade. Salt moved across the empire not just on wagons but on ships, mule trains, and on foot, overland and upriver. Some key Roman sources of salt included Ostia and the Tiber Delta, seawater salt harvested in pans. Sicily, inland salt mines and coastal evaporation basins. Numidia, North Africa, salt from desert basins and coastal plains. Gaul and Germania, rock salt from mines in the Alps and inland Europe. Britannia, particularly near Cheshire, where brine springs were exploited. Salt was relatively cheap at the source but became expensive with distance. Cities far from the sea like Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, or Augusta Vindelicorum, Augsburg, paid high prices. The empire responded by standardizing trade routes, creating salt monopolies, and at times taxing its transport. In some provinces, salt was under direct state control. Prices were fixed, transport was monitored. Punishment for illegal salt trade could be harsh. In this way, salt was not only a commodity, it was a tool of regulation. Salt workers and their world. Behind the movement of salt stood thousands of unseen laborers. Evaporators who tended shallow salt pans under the sun. Miners who chipped away at rock salt deep underground. Carriers who loaded brine-soaked baskets onto carts. Packers who wrapped salt in clay, linen, or hide for storage. These workers operated in grueling conditions. In the North African sun, salt pans reflected light so intensely that laborers suffered eye damage. In the Alpine mines, cold and damp brought respiratory disease. There are few surviving inscriptions that record their names, but one simple carving from a Gaulish salt site reads, Lucius Salinarius, 20 seasons. Lucius Salt Worker, 20 seasons. 20 years, 2 decades of boiling brine under the sky, that was his life. Salt in the home. In Roman kitchens, salt sat in small containers near the hearth or table. The salinum was a dish for salt, sometimes ceramic, sometimes bronze, occasionally silver in wealthy homes. Salt was so central that seating arrangements could reflect status in relation to the salt dish. To sit above the salt would later come to mean proximity to the head of the household. Salted dishes were common: cured olives with brine, boiled greens with salted oil, pork belly rubbed with salt and spices, salted fish layered in clay pots. Even bread was salted, though the quantity varied by region. Roman cooks adjusted their saltiness with garum, which contained both salt and umami flavors. Salt was so common that to be without it was a sign of dire poverty. Ritual and metaphor. Salt crossed into metaphor in Roman culture. It symbolized permanence. Treaties sealed with salt were considered binding. Purity. Salt washed away spiritual corruption in temple rites. Loyalty. The sharing of salt between guests could create a bond of trust. Sacrifice. As part of mole salsa, salt was burned alongside grain in offerings. These metaphors survive today in idioms. Worth his salt. To take something with a grain of salt. Salt of the earth. Each of these, in some small way, echoes a Roman sensibility of a thing so ordinary it became unnoticed, yet so essential it became unquestionable. Ending thought. Salt built no monuments. It inspired no poetry. It left behind no grand ruins. But without it, the empire could not have eaten, marched, or prayed. So we ask, was Rome truly founded on stone and bronze, or on the quiet crystals that vanished into its bread, its wounds, and its armies? Picture the Roman Empire at its height. It stretches from the wild coasts of Britannia to the sand-swept reaches of Egypt, from the misty forests of Germania to the sun-baked rocks of Syria. Over this vast network of land and sea, roads and rivers, there moves a quiet tide, white, crystalline, indispensable. Salt. In this section, we move beyond the household and the battlefield to explore the economic arteries of the Roman world. Salt was not merely consumed. It was traded, taxed, stored, and politicized. It gave rise to cities, funded provincial administrations, and sparked disputes. It was both a mundane necessity and a calculated tool of empire. Let us follow the salt routes. Salt routes across the provinces. Salt did not originate in one place, nor did it move in one direction. It flowed like water where it was needed, constrained by geography and political will. Major sources. Ostia and the Tiber Delta sea salt, refined in large clay pans, sent inland via the Via Salaria. Sicily, both sea salt and inland deposits near Trapani, some of the finest in the Mediterranean. Dalmatian coast, high-yield coastal evaporation sites, traded along the Via Egnatia. Alpine salt mines Hallstatt and Salzburg from Salz, meaning salt, supplied Central Europe. Cheshire, Britannia, brine springs and boiling houses in what is now northwest England. Numidia and Mauritania, dry salt pans chots, harvested in arid climates. Salt moved by river barges, e.g., along the Rhone, Danube, Po, and Tiber. Pack animals on mountain trails. Sea cargo in amphorae, or wrapped in animal hides. Road convoys, particularly when shipping inland. Each route had its dangers: pirates, bandits, weather, and local tolls. But salt merchants endured. The profits were steady, the demand constant. Salt never went out of fashion. Rome's salt bureaucracy. As the empire matured, the trade in salt became increasingly regulated. What had once been the domain of local traders and communities was absorbed into a centralized system of control. The state oversaw salt through official contractors, called conductors salinarum, who leased rights to harvest and distribute salt. Provincial governors, who imposed local taxes on the production or transit of salt. Military logistics officers, who ensured salt rations reached distant legions. Municipal councils, which sometimes oversaw local distribution. The term saliny referred to saltworks, either coastal pans or inland mines. These were sometimes publicly owned, sometimes leased to private families or guilds. The Roman treasury profited from both arrangements. One preserved inscription from Hispania reads, Salina Veturia, property of the city of Emerita, leased to Marcus Trebellius for 5,000 sesterces annually. Even in the provinces, salt was recorded, measured, and monetized. Salt and taxation. Salt taxation was not new to Rome, but the empire perfected its use as a tool of public revenue and population control. Salt was ideal for taxation because it was universally consumed. It was traceable along specific routes. It was essential, so evasion was rare. While not as formalized as later salt taxes in medieval China or France, Roman salt levies were proportional to transit weight, enforced at customs point stations, along roads and rivers, managed locally, with a portion remitted to the imperial treasury. Salt taxes might appear on public records, known as vectigalia, which detailed duties paid on goods. In border provinces, salt was sometimes exempt to incentivize loyalty. In more prosperous regions, it could be taxed at double rates to fund civic projects or military campaigns. Thus, salt became a subtle indicator of privilege and punishment, a quiet but constant tool in the empire's economic machinery. Storage and security. Once harvested, salt needed storage. It was too valuable to leave exposed. Romans stored salt in clay jars sealed with wax or pitch, large warehouses, often near ports or military supply depots, stone vaults, in the case of inland cities or military outposts. Security was essential. Salt attracted rodents, thieves, and moisture. Storage required guarding by soldiers or slaves, regular inspection by municipal officials, careful rotation to prevent spoilage. It was common for towns to appoint a local salt overseer, sometimes an honorary position, other times a full-time bureaucrat. This individual prefectus salis ensured proper pricing, storage, and distribution. In coastal towns, entire neighborhoods were centered around salt works, forming labor-based microeconomies. In inland towns, salt vaults were among the most guarded civic structures, rivaling even the treasury. Salt and diplomacy. Salt was not always taxed, it was sometimes gifted. Rome used salt as a diplomatic tool, providing free access to salt supplies for loyal provinces, client kings, and military allies. For example, the Frisians, in what is now the Netherlands, received salt access in exchange for their cooperation with Roman legions in northern campaigns. Dacian tribes were offered trade rights to Roman salt in exchange for peace treaties. Nabatean merchants moving through Petra received salt allocations to preserve their perishable goods. In this way, salt became a currency of favor, something given not to enrich, but to bind. Salt's influence on city growth. Many Roman towns and cities owe their origin or growth to salt trade. Some examples: Salona, Dalmatia, a major salt port on the Adriatic. Saldi, Numidia, coastal town that managed salt pans and regional exports. Salaria, Italy, village-turned-trade hub along the Via Salaria. Salzburg, Austria, continued to flourish after Rome, its salt mines still in use today. Novi Amegas, Gaul, site of salt fairs and seasonal trade convoys. The presence of salt drew infrastructure, markets, military posts, and religious shrines. Salt enabled city growth in areas otherwise considered remote or undesirable. It created nodes, fixed points in the ever-moving map of empire. When salt meant conflict, salt also sparked disputes. Records from the 12 Tables and provincial edicts reveal conflicts over salt springs between villages, sabotage of rival salt works, bribery of salt inspectors, smuggling across provincial lines to avoid taxation. In one fragment of legal commentary, a senator writes, "Better to lose grain for a month than salt for a week. The people will complain, but they will not riot." Salt was not just flavor, it was civil stability. Ending thought. The Romans built temples to Jupiter and theaters for Cicero, but they also built roads for salt. In the choices of where to place roads, settle towns, and assign taxes, the quiet crystal shaped an empire's destiny. So we wonder, if salt is so ordinary, why did it move armies, raise cities, and finance emperors? The empire fell. Not all at once, not everywhere, and not without resistance, but eventually, the statues were toppled, the aqueducts crumbled, and the legions withdrew. Provinces became kingdoms, temples became churches, and laws were rewritten in new tongues. But salt remained. It was still needed, still harvested, still carried over roads, some Roman, some new. It no longer bore the official seal of an emperor, nor was it taxed with the same precision. But it remained embedded in the very habits of life, sprinkled over food, rubbed into meat, soaked into cloth, mixed into bread. In this final section, we follow what happened to salt after the fall of Rome, how it moved quietly through medieval trade, persisted in language and ritual, and became part of the modern world's culinary and symbolic vocabulary. The builders of the empire may be long gone, but the salt they cherished is still in your kitchen drawer. The disruption of empire. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, many systems of organized taxation and distribution, especially around commodities like salt, broke down. Trade routes became fractured or dangerous. Saltworks were abandoned or fell into local hands. Records of taxation, salt monopolies, and overseers disappear from inscriptions and papyri. What remained was a localized salt economy. Where once salt had flowed from coordinated imperial centers, it now emerged from regional production, governed by feudal lords, monastic orders, or city-states. In places where salt sources were abundant, like the marshes of Venice, the mines of Salzburg, or the coastal pans of Marseille, new powers rose to control it. But the Roman vision of state-controlled supply, salt for soldiers, and monitored trade routes faded. The infrastructure remained in places. Roman roads, old storehouses, even salt pans continued in use. But the empire's coordination, its ability to move salt to the right place at the right time, was gone. Still, salt endured. Salt and the monasteries. In a world where knowledge and literacy retreated into the cloisters of abbeys and monasteries, it was often monks who preserved and continued the Roman knowledge of salt production and usage. Monasteries near coastline maintained salt pans for preserving food. Inland abbeys controlled access to brine wells and salt springs. Salt was vital in preserving fish, especially during fasting days when meat was forbidden. Monastic kitchens developed recipes using salted vegetables, beans, and pickled items. In places like Cluny, Monte Cassino, and Lindisfarne, monks carried forward the quiet continuity of salt, not as empire but as ritual and rhythm. Even in liturgy, salt maintained symbolic meaning. Baptismal water was often blessed with a pinch of salt, echoing Roman purification rites. The phrase sal sapientiae, the salt of wisdom, appears in early Christian texts, tying physical salt to spiritual clarity. The medieval salt trade. By the 10th and 11th centuries, salt had re-emerged as a major economic force, this time through regional monopolies and trade fairs. The Great Salt Road in Italy, via del Sale, carried salt from Ligurian coasts into the Lombard plains. In France, the gabelle, a royal salt tax, became infamous for its burden on the poor, so severe that salt smuggling, known as faux sonnage, became a common crime. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, salt trade helped build cities. Salzburg, named literally Salt Fortress, grew rich on salt mined in the Alps. Lemberg in Germany, extracted salt from underground brine, and exported it northward. In Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine became one of the largest and most ornate salt mines in the world, in continuous operation since the 13th century. Though no longer imperial, the logic of Roman salt trade lived on in infrastructure, civic control, and the understanding that salt, more than gold, was the bedrock of social order. Linguistic remnants. Even as Latin faded from public speech, salt stayed in the words of many languages. Salary from salarium, the Roman salt allowance. Sauce from salsus, meaning salted. Salad, originally herba salata, salted greens. Sausage from salsiccia, literally salted meat. Salami, salmorgio, salsa all descend from Roman culinary salt terminology. In idioms, salt retained moral weight. Worth his salt. Salt of the earth. Take it with a grain of salt. To be salty, a modern phrase for bitterness, still evoking that ancient sharpness. Salt was never just seasoning. It was a metaphor refined by centuries of practical use. Salt and myth. Over time, salt absorbed mythic and symbolic weight in medieval and early modern superstition. Spilling salt was a bad omen perhaps, because it symbolized waste of wealth or ruptured protection. Throwing salt over one's left shoulder was said to blind the devil. Salt was used in warding rituals, sprinkled across thresholds or on cradles. Some of these beliefs may have Roman roots. The notion of salt as purifier, as a tool in both blessing and banishment, persisted long after the original rituals had been forgotten. Salt in the modern world. Today, salt is cheap, almost invisible in its availability. We do not build roads for it. We do not tax it, at least not severely. We do not think of it as a foundation of power. And yet, it is in every packaged food. It is used in industrial processes, from chemical manufacturing to water treatment. It is still used in rituals, in preservation, and in language. Roman salt pans still operate in parts of Italy. Roman brine wells are still drawn in Britain. And Roman roads first built to carry salt are paved over with highways and streets where cars now move instead of carts. In a way, the empire never left. It merely became quieter. What remains? What remains is not a monument, but a pattern. A trade route. A salted recipe. A word in a contract. A superstition in a kitchen. A paved road once called the Via Salaria, now used by tourists and taxis. Salt doesn't last because it is dramatic. It lasts because it is needed, invisible, and everywhere. It endures in the places where history is not written in marble, but in motion, in habit, in the crystalline memory of things we still consume without noticing. Salt final reflection. Rome's emperors ruled through law, stone, and spectacle, but their reach, their roads, their soldiers, none could exist without this granular foundation. The empire may have dissolved into fragments, but salt never did. It sits on your table unchanged, quiet, present, just as it was 2,000 years ago. Amphora Story 4, The Amphora's Long Journey. In a quiet workshop outside a Roman port town, perhaps near Ostia, or farther east in Rhodes, a man leans over a wheel, wet clay spinning under his hands. He is not a sculptor. He does not carve marble gods or inscribe triumphal arches. His work is simpler, more repetitive. He shapes amphorae, the humble clay vessels that will carry olive oil, wine, garum, and grain across the empire. His name may never be known, but his labor will touch the lives of merchants, sailors, soldiers, cooks, and even emperors. This story follows a single amphora, not fictional, but typical, from its creation in a dusty workshop to its final resting place, perhaps in a kitchen corner or shattered at the bottom of a shipwreck. It is a story not of wars or politics, but of object permanence, of mundane usefulness, and of the millions of unseen choices that kept Rome functioning. We begin with clay. Clay from the earth. To make an amphora, you need two things: clay and fire. The clay came from riverbanks, coastal plains, or hillside pits dug by laborers using simple tools, baskets, and their own hands. The clay was reddish, gray, or brown, depending on its mineral content. Rich in iron oxide, this clay would turn various shades of terracotta when fired. Before shaping, the clay had to be prepared. Mixed with water. Needed to remove air bubbles. Sometimes mixed with crushed pottery shards or sand for strength, this was called temper. Clay was heavy. Gathering and preparing it was laborious. It was often done by slaves or day laborers, not the potters themselves. In workshops near production hubs like Arezzo, Pozzuoli, or Gaul, amphora making was a seasonal industry, dictated by both weather and trade schedules. The pottery workshops. Amphorae were made in workshops, called figlini, which could range from one-man operations to large-scale state-run factories. The process involved throwing. The amphora's neck and body were shaped on a wheel. Coiling or assembling. In larger workshops, parts were molded separately and assembled. Handles attached, with a curved pull from shoulder to neck. Stamping. Some amphorae were stamped with workshop names, imperial marks, or merchant symbols. Drying. The shaped vessels were dried in open air for several days. Firing. Amphorae were baked in kilns at 801,000 degrees C. The kilns were dome structures, often shared among potters. The firing process could take 2 days, including heating, baking, and cooling. Breakage was common. Misfired amphorae were tossed aside. Shards from such vessels now fill Monte Testaccio in Rome, an artificial hill made of discarded amphora fragments. Standardized shapes and codes. Roman amphorae were not artistic objects. They were tools of commerce, and so they were made to fit standards. Amphora Dressel 1, for wine used in Republican period, bulky, heavy, rounded. Dressel 20, used for olive oil, especially from Hispania, bulbous body, thick walls. Gaulis 4, a Gallic variant used for local wine. Tripolitanian amphorae, from North Africa, used for garum and oil. Each shape had a code, understood by traders and dockworkers. Most amphorae were designed to be stackable. They tapered to a pointed base, perfect for nestling into ships, sand, or wooden racks. Sealable. The mouth was closed with waxed corks, ceramic lids, or clay plugs. Labelable. Often painted or inscribed with abbreviations: producer name, contents, weight, destination. A typical inscription might read: C. Valerius, wine, Sescia vintage, weight 32 libri to Ostia. This humble clay object was now ready for trade. Loading the amphora. Once fired, the amphora was purchased or requisitioned. Private merchants bought amphorae in bulk. Military quartermasters arranged shipments for army supplies. Imperial agents sourced amphorae for Annona, the grain and food dole. The newly minted amphora would be filled with wine, oil, or garum, sealed, and perhaps painted with a red or black slip to resist salt water. Carriers loaded amphorae by hand, using cradles, sacks, or wooden yokes. These workers, often porters, slaves, or freedmen, labored under the sun, and alongside dock noise, animal calls, and the crack of overseers' orders. Some amphorae traveled by road lashed to carts and jolted along stone pavements. Others were destined for river barges, especially in Gaul and Egypt. But the majority, especially those from coastal workshops, would go to sea. The port of departure. Let us imagine this particular amphora filled with Campanian red wine, corked and sealed, arrives in Ostia, Rome's bustling port. Here it joins thousands of others, stacked in warehouses called horia. The largest, Horia Galbi, housed oil shipments from Hispania and Africa. Ostia's port, protected by breakwaters and Trajan's artificial harbor, bustled with movement. Stevedores with calloused hands lifting cargo. Clerks logging contents onto wax tablets. Overseers shouting. Vendors calling out bread, fish, or chickpeas to hungry laborers. Every amphora was inspected, weighed, and taxed if applicable. It might be marked with a chalking symbol, a custom seal, or a ship's assignment. The amphora might sit for days or weeks, depending on tides, wind, and cargo scheduling. When its time came, it would be loaded onto a merchant vessel, a navis honoraria with dozens or hundreds of others. Each one balanced with care. One misplaced amphora could cause a shift in cargo and disaster. Ending thought. This amphora is not rare. It is not beautiful. It is not meant to last. And yet it has moved from earth to fire to port to sea. It carries not just wine, but the invisible weight of commerce, routine, and hands that shaped it silently. So we ask, how many untold journeys lie buried in these fragments of clay, still whispering from the bottom of ancient seas? The ship groans beneath the weight. Dozens of crewmen swarm across the deck, stowing rope, adjusting sails, and shouting orders in Latin, Greek, Punic, and other dialects. You can smell the sea, but also fish oil, wet wood, and the faint but sour tang of fermented wine leaking from cracked amphorae. Your amphora, the one made weeks ago in a dusty workshop, is now nestled with hundreds of others in the belly of a merchant ship, or navis honoraria. Its destination, likely Puteoli, Massilia, or perhaps as far as Gads, but the final buyer may be unknown even to the captain. Its fate lies at the mercy of wind, current, coin, and time. In this section, we follow that amphora across the maritime highways of Rome, not through heroics or storms, though there were many, but through routine. The systems that kept it afloat, the dockworkers who shifted it, the scribes who recorded it, and the networks of trade that carried it from hand to hand. This is the story of commerce without glory, and labor without monuments. The Mediterranean Sea as infrastructure. To the Romans, the Mare Nostrum, our sea, was not a natural barrier. It was a conduit, a liquid road network. Unlike land travel, which was slow and bound by terrain, sea travel, though dangerous, was efficient. A journey from Ostia to Carthage might take 4 to 6 days under favorable conditions. The same route by road would take weeks. And so the empire built its economy around sea lanes. Oil from Baetica, southern Spain to Rome. Grain from Alexandria to Ostia. Wine from Campania to Gaul. Garum from Carthage to Britannia. Marble from Paros to construction sites in Anatolia. Every cargo manifest included amphorae. The Roman commercial ship corbita, or honoraria, was broad and slow, designed for volume, not speed. A typical vessel might carry 1,000 amphorae or more, depending on size. Loading and stowing. Inside the ship, amphorae were stacked in rows, their pointed bottoms sunk into a bed of sand or wooden grates for stability. The process was methodical. Large amphorae on the bottom. Lighter goods like textiles or baskets above. Each layer cushioned by straw or rope netting. Fragile amphorae, sometimes wrapped in cloth or leather. Access hatches cut for customs inspections en route. Scribes noted contents and origin on wax tablets, the Roman version of shipping logs, a surviving tablet from Pompeii records. 67 amphorae, olive oil from Hispania Baetica, consigned to L. Crassus at Puteoli. Some ships had guards, most didn't. The risk of loss through storm, piracy, or fraud was simply part of the commercial rhythm. The perils of the voyage. Amphorae were durable, but they weren't indestructible. Ships leaked, waves struck, dockworkers dropped them. Common threats included storms. Autumn seas were treacherous. Sailing season usually ended by November and resumed in March. Piracy, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, before Pompey's famous campaign in 67 BCE. Spoilage, amphorae could leak or ferment if improperly sealed. Theft, a few missing jars out of hundreds, were rarely noticed. Yet despite all this, millions of amphorae survived their journey or part of it. Some ended up shattered in warehouses. Others rolled into kitchens. Still others sank to the ocean floor, now lying silently in shipwrecks discovered by modern divers. Port of arrival. Imagine now the ship arriving at Puteoli, Rome's largest commercial port before the rise of Ostia. The docks bustle. Stevedores with calloused hands carry crates. Clerks shout across cargo bays. Port inspectors unseal amphorae to sample contents. Dock priests offer brief prayers to Neptune or Portunus. Your amphora is offloaded and set aside, along with others marked with the same merchant symbol. The owner, perhaps a freedman wine dealer or local tavern supplier, arrives to inspect the cargo. He counts the jars, samples one, frowns slightly, pays the fee, and signs a wax tablet receipt with a stylus. Your amphora moves again, this time by ox cart, hand cart, or pack mule to a storage cellar in the Subura, Trastevere, or a countryside villa. Dockside life. The world of the port was one of constant labor. Day laborers, often slaves or freedmen, were paid in bread, coin, or wine. Water carriers, crane operators, and rope fixers worked in rhythm. Children sometimes scavenged broken amphorae for sharp clay shards to sell. Taverns and brothels clustered near the docks, offering escape or comfort. Customs agents, not always honest, collected taxes and turned blind eyes when needed. Few of these people would ever own the goods they carried, but they knew them by weight, smell, texture, and mark. To them, an amphora wasn't abstract. It was a day's wage, a strained shoulder, a cracked fingernail. Reuse and repurposing. Once emptied, amphorae rarely traveled back. Instead, they were reused for local storage: water, grain, oil, or vinegar. Repurposed as building material: shards added to concrete, whole jars sunk into floors as cooling jars. Broken intentionally and deposited in waste heaps. The most famous of these heaps is Monte Testaccio in Rome, a hill made of over 50 million amphora fragments, almost all from olive oil jars imported to the city. Scholars have examined the fragments to reconstruct trade networks. Each broken jar tells its point of origin, often stamped on the handle, its contents painted or etched, the merchant or official who handled it. These broken jars are not just trash, they are the data archive of Roman commerce. The long shadow of clay. Clay is fragile, yet it survives. Metal rusts, wood rots, but fired clay, once broken, remains. Today, archaeologists uncover amphorae in wrecks preserved in silt, tombs used as urns, farm fields turned up by plows, wall foundations where jars reinforced ancient mortar. Every amphora fragment is a marker of labor, not of emperors or victories, but of workshops, hands, and routine. Ending thought. This amphora began as dust, shaped by fingers, fired in heat, filled with wine, and sent across the sea. It was held, lifted, dropped, sold, and finally broken. Not a story of greatness, but of utility. So we ask, how many invisible hands are needed to move one simple jar across an empire? The amphora has traveled far. Born in dust, fired in heat, carried by calloused hands, and rocked by Mediterranean winds, it has now found rest in a Roman kitchen, or perhaps in the back corner of a bustling tavern near the Subura, where laughter and oil lamps flicker against smoke-darkened walls. This section completes the amphora's quiet journey, not to triumph or ceremony, but to service. We explore its presence in the everyday Roman world, in homes, streets, shops, and the margins of life where food was stored, wine was poured, and time passed unnoticed. It is a tale not of ruins or conquests, but of persistence, how something so ordinary as a clay vessel became part of everything, everywhere, every day. In the Roman kitchen. In a modest domus, perhaps the home of a merchant family in Trastevere, your amphora has been placed near the culina, or kitchen. The kitchen is not large. It is dark, smoky, often without chimneys. Brick ovens radiate heat. Iron pots hang from hooks. Shelves hold lentils, dried figs, olive paste, and garum. And in the corner, your amphora, upright in a ceramic or wooden stand. It holds wine. Not fine Falernian wine, but vinum ordinaire blended, diluted, sometimes sweetened with honey or herbs, perhaps mulled for winter, perhaps poured over stale bread in a poor man's meal called pools. The amphora is tipped gently. A wooden ladle dips into the wide neck. The wine is poured into a ceramic jug for serving. It leaves rings of red sediment over time, marks of use, like lines on a tree. In wealthier homes, the amphora might be stored in a service room, or even underground in a hypocaust-cooled storage cellar. But for most Romans, it was simply a container functioning and familiar. At the tavern. Step across the alley and into a popina, a Roman tavern. It's early evening. Oil lamps are lit. Laborers crowd in, still covered in dust from brickwork or field chores. The walls are painted with rough murals, gladiators, birds, bits of graffiti. Lucius O. Sextus I, as of Saturnalia. Behind the counter, amphorae are stored in cut-out stone or wooden niches in the bar called dolia for the larger jars, or racks for the more common ones. Your amphora, partially emptied, stands upright. Its neck has been chipped, perhaps hastily resealed with wax. The contents are diluted and mixed, possibly extended with seawater to stretch profits. Wine is sold by the cup, a few asses per pour. It's served in clay mugs, rarely washed. A customer stumbles, the amphora sways, someone shouts, a splash hits the floor. The jar remains upright for now. As trash in architecture. Eventually, the amphora is emptied. Perhaps the last drops are poured at a funeral banquet, or simply consumed with barley stew and fish paste on a rainy day. Now, what remains is a decision. If intact, it may be reused to store vinegar, rainwater, or ashes. If cracked, it may become scrap smashed for pottery filler, repurposed in drainage ditches, or discarded in refuse piles. Rome, ever practical, reused everything. Builders incorporated amphora shards into concrete. Roof tiles were made from old ceramic. In villas, amphorae were buried neck down in pantries to cool stored goods, acting as ancient refrigeration. In poorer districts, cracked amphorae were turned into urinals, flower pots, or simple seating stools. A child might even use one as a makeshift toy drum, tapping its sides with a stick. The amphora became invisible again, not in distance, but in familiarity. It ceased to be object and became background. Shards beneath the soil. The centuries passed. Rome fell, the taverns emptied, the kitchens crumbled. Amphorae, shattered and covered by dust, settled into the layers of time. Today, archaeologists find them. In Monte Testaccio, a man-made hill of olive oil jars, each fragment telling of shipments and cellars long forgotten. In shipwrecks, perfectly preserved by silt, stacked as they were when last touched by Roman hands. In excavations, where painted inscriptions still read the names of traders, vintages, or emperors' stamps. Each shard is a message, preserved not for its glory but for its volume. There were simply too many to disappear. Legacy and influence. The Roman amphora was never luxurious, but it influenced storage vessels for centuries. Byzantine amphorae carried oil into the Middle Ages. Islamic and European merchants used similar shapes for wine and spices. Even today, the iconic jug shape persists in terracotta pots, wine bottles, and olive oil packaging. Modern replicas are sold to tourists in Rome, often glazed or polished, but always tracing back to that ancient form. Tapered bottom, narrow neck, looped handles. We recognize the shape instinctively, not because it is beautiful but because it worked. The unseen economy. The story of the amphora is a story of invisible labor. The potter who shaped it with hands worn from repetition. The kiln worker who hauled firewood to feed the flames. The stevedore who balanced it on his back across the docks. The merchant who recorded its weight in wax. The housewife who ladled wine from its lip each evening. The child who tripped over its shards in the alley. The builder who packed it into a wall for insulation. The archaeologist who brushed dust from its handle 2,000 years later. Each one touched the amphora, each one forgot it. But the amphora remembered. Amphora final reflection. To walk the streets of Rome in the 1st century CE was to see amphorae everywhere stacked in corners, lining bar counters, bobbing on ships, resting in courtyards. They were not admired. They were not counted. But without them nothing moved. No olive oil to market, no wine to soldiers, no grain to the hungry, no commerce at all. And in this, the amphora is a symbol of history itself, not made by heroes or headlines, but by hands, routine, and the quiet weight of repetition. Story 5. Dormant Roads, the Long Sleep of the Via Flaminia. You walk not in silence, but in the echoes of 1,000 footsteps. The road is old, not ruined, just quiet, lined with overgrown grass, half-buried stones, and olive trees long since gnarled by time. It once rang with the sound of iron-rimmed wheels, the trudge of marching sandals, and the clipped Latin of imperial couriers. But now, the Via Flaminia rests. This is the story of a road not just as infrastructure, but as memory. Built in the heat of Roman ambition, trodden by soldiers, pilgrims, peasants, and peddlers, it carried more than feet and wheels. It bore bills of war, barrels of wine, recruits for distant provinces, and letters home from campaigns long forgotten. In this section, we begin with its birth, the planning, paving, and purpose of the Via Flaminia, one of Rome's oldest arterial highways. Not heroic, not glamorous, but necessary. Who was Flamininus? The name Flaminia comes from Gaius Flaminius, a Roman censor who, in 220 BCE, undertook the construction of this vital road. He wasn't a grand general or a charismatic dictator. He was a politician, a man focused on infrastructure, not oratory. His goal was simple: build a reliable road connecting Rome to the Adriatic Sea, ending in Ariminum, modern Rimini. The stretch would become the spine of military logistics and northern trade, eventually forming a route into the Alps and beyond. This was not Rome's first road, but it was one of its most vital. The tools of the trade. Building a Roman road was tedious. There were no bulldozers, no concrete mixers, just picks, shovels, hammers, and sweat. Surveyors began by choosing the most direct route possible, often ignoring terrain difficulties. Roman roads were famous for their straightness, sometimes cutting through hills rather than curving around them. The method of construction involved clearing vegetation, leveling the path, digging a trench, usually 4-6 feet deep, filling the trench in layers, stodum foundation stones, rudis crushed gravel or rubble, nucleus finer gravel or sand, summum dorsum large paving stones. Each layer was compacted with water and tamped down, often by teams of laborers, freedmen, slaves, soldiers, and conscripted locals. The final surface was slightly arched, allowing rain to run off. Ditches were dug along the sides. Milestones or miliaria were planted at intervals, often inscribed with the emperor's name and the distance to Rome. In total, the Via Flaminia stretched over 300 kilometers. Stone upon stone. The stones used for the paving were basalt, limestone, or travertine, depending on the region. Some were locally quarried, others were hauled overland for miles, with oxen groaning beneath their weight. Each stone was hand-cut. They didn't fit perfectly, but the roadbed below gave them stability. Over time, traffic would smooth their surfaces. Paving a kilometer of road could take weeks, even with a full team. And yet the Romans persisted because they knew roads were control. With the Via Flaminia in place, Rome could move. Troops to quell northern tribes. Grain from the fertile Po Valley. News between Rome and Gaul. Tax revenue to imperial coffers. The road as theater. By the late Republic, the Via Flaminia had become more than just a route, it was a processional path. Triumphal marches often began here. Generals returning from war might enter the Campus Martius by way of the Milvian Bridge, which stood astride the Via Flaminia as it crossed the Tiber. The bridge, rebuilt many times, stood watch as countless processions passed. Troops, dignitaries, bishops, even emperors. Today it carries modern cars, but in its time it saw Hannibal's enemies, Julius Caesar's allies, and Christian pilgrims heading to Rome. But traffic was not always majestic. Most of the time, the road saw vendors, ox carts, donkey trains, and postal couriers with satchels of scrolls. A courier might travel 60 kilometers a day, changing horses at mutations, relay stations, placed every 10-15 miles. Rest stations, mansions, offered travelers food, baths, and sometimes beds. Poorer travelers slept roadside, among the thistles and cicadas. The everyday sound of travel. Imagine you are standing beside the Via Flaminia, around 100 BCE. You hear the creak of wagon wheels, the clop of horses, the occasional bark of a camp dog. Merchants arguing in Latin, Greek, and Umbrian. A farmer leading pigs. Children chasing chickens across the road. A legionary singing a marching chant under his breath. Dust hangs in the air. The sun bakes the stone. Time moves slowly, but the road is never still. Even when not in use, the road seemed to remember footsteps. The road into empire. As Rome expanded, the Via Flaminia became part of a broader network, connecting to the Via Aemilia, stretching east to west across northern Italy, joining the Via Cassia, heading northwest toward Etruria, linking with the Via Salaria, the Old Salt Road. This network ensured that Rome remained the center militarily, economically, and spiritually. At its peak, the Via Flaminia was traversed by senators returning to villas in Umbria, engineers inspecting aqueducts, tax collectors making their rounds, pilgrims visiting country shrines, and eventually barbarians marching south. The road did not choose who walked it, it simply endured. Ending thought. Built by orders scribbled on wax tablets, maintained by men whose names we'll never know, the Via Flaminia stretched across centuries. But what happens when roads are no longer used, when milestones are weathered, bridges cracked, and traffic ceases? Does a road sleep, or does it vanish? The stones remember. Not in the way a person remembers, not with thoughts or feelings, but with scars. The grooves worn by iron wagon wheels, the chips from horse hooves, the faded inscriptions of emperors now forgotten. The Via Flaminia was once a highway of empire. Now, as the centuries pass, it becomes a quiet observer to the retreat of Rome. This section follows the Via Flaminia after its prime. As traffic slowed, armies withdrew, and the Western Empire crumbled, leaving the road to change roles. No longer the lifeblood of the Republic or Empire, it became the pathway of pilgrims, hermits, goat herds, and dust. The fall without collapse. Roads rarely end in catastrophe, they fade. The Via Flaminia didn't die when the Roman Empire fell. There was no explosion, no dramatic abandonment. Instead, as imperial control receded in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the road's importance shifted. Garrisons were withdrawn, engineers stopped filling potholes, relay stations closed. The cursus publicus Rome's official courier system fell into disrepair, but still the road remained. Peasants still used it to reach markets, priests still walked it between towns, the stones still held. And yet without the centralized force of Rome, the grip of maintenance loosened. Over time, grasses grew between the stones. Bridges weakened and collapsed. Side ditches clogged with runoff. Travelers rerouted around damaged sections. Way stations became abandoned ruins, scavenged for stone. In some places, the road simply sank beneath the soil, buried by centuries of silt, rain, and disuse. A road for pilgrims. By the 6th century, the Via Flaminia found a new purpose: pilgrimage. Christianity had become the dominant religion in the former empire. Rome, once the seat of emperors, was now the center of the Catholic Church. The tombs of apostles Peter and Paul drew pilgrims from across Europe. And how did they get there? By walking the old Roman roads. The Via Flaminia, stretching north to south, remained one of the few continuous routes into the Eternal City. Its milestones, though weathered, still guided the faithful. Churches and monasteries sprang up along its edges. Some housed relics, others simply offered rest and bread. Where once mansions had served governors, now abbeys and hermitages served souls. Travelers included poor peasants walking barefoot from Ravenna, nobles in worn cloaks seeking penance, Benedictine monks on ecclesiastical errands, pilgrims carrying icons, prayers, and coin. They walked slowly, stopping often, leaving offerings at roadside shrines, sometimes sleeping under trees. The road was no longer fast, it was devotional. Saintly detours and sacred landmarks. Over time, the Via Flaminia developed its own spiritual geography. Legends sprouted along its path, some based on truth, others shaped by generations of retelling. Stories of saints who had walked the road, healed on its stones, or died in its shadow. A cracked milestone might become a healing stone, a crumbling bridge, a place of miraculous crossings. Churches were often built on top of Roman ruins. San Giacomo del Marca, erected near the remnants of a Roman toll house. Santa Midio, beside an ancient rest station, now a shrine to protection from earthquakes. Santa Maria in Via, a chapel named not for its town, but for the fact it stood literally on the road. Pilgrims would pause at these places, light candles, leave scraps of cloth, or bury written prayers beneath stones. And thus, layer by layer, a new purpose covered the old one. Life along the fatting path. Though travel was slower, the road still supported life. In the medieval era, small hamlets dotted its length. Farmers used the road to take goods to market. Mule trains carried salt, wool, and barley. Goatherds led their flocks down the center, bells clinking. A few local inns survived, ramshackle but functional. Travelers could buy a meal of bread, beans, and wine. Horses might be watered, shoes resoled, cloaks patched. But the days of imperial logistics were over. The road no longer served an empire, it served villages. And as centuries turned, locals forgot who built the road. The name Flaminia survived on maps, but among the people it became simply the Old Road, or La Strada Vecchia. When nature reclaims. In parts of Umbria and the Apennines, the road simply disappeared. Landslides buried segments, forests crept in, Roman bridges collapsed into rivers. In quiet valleys, the only sign of the road was a stray paving stone, half swallowed by soil, or the slight unnatural straightness of a tree-lined path. Farmers plowed over it. Shepherds used it as a shortcut. Children played upon its ruins, unaware that senators and generals once walked those same stones. Nature does not erase human work quickly, but it does so without pause. Rediscovery without glory. In the 17th and 18th centuries, antiquarians and early archaeologists began to document the remains of the old Roman roads. They measured stone widths, transcribed worn inscriptions, catalogued bridge remains, but they were often disappointed. The Via Flaminia did not lead to temples or treasure. It led to broken walls, milestone fragments, and muddy lanes used by farmers to move sheep. And yet these traces told a story of continuity. Unlike ruins sealed beneath ash or sand, the Via Flaminia had remained in use, changing function but never truly abandoned. It had been used into obscurity. Ending thought. When does a road stop being a road? When its stones are lost, when its name is forgotten, or when no one walks it with purpose anymore? And if it is still used, even unknowingly, by shepherds and children, can it ever truly be said to have ended? A path is more than pavement. It is memory traced in footsteps, in wheel grooves, in the accidental alignment of hedgerows. The Via Flaminia, like many Roman roads, was never truly erased, it simply changed identity. In this final section, we explore how a forgotten highway was rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reused, not as an imperial artery, but as a part of modern life, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes revered. The Flaminian Way still exists, but in fragments, footpaths, highways, and half-remembered names. It is a road remembered not by historians alone, but by farmers, hikers, archaeologists, and mapmakers, each drawing their own lines over the ghosts of empire. The antiquarian eye. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars across Europe began to catalog the remnants of the Roman world. They were drawn to roads not for their glamour, but for their stubbornness. The Via Flaminia, in particular, fascinated early Italian antiquarians because it connected so many historical layers. Roman engineering, medieval pilgrimage, Renaissance villages, Baroque chapels. They walked its length with notebooks in hand, copying mile markers and sketching the foundations of bridges. Some dug into roadside ruins. Others followed riverbeds, guessing where causeways must have crossed. They often found modern paths overlaying ancient ones. This wasn't surprising. Romans built roads so well that centuries of travelers reused them, sometimes without knowing. The puzzle of fragments. The modern Via Flaminia is not a single, continuous stretch of original Roman road. It is a patchwork. Some sections are buried beneath modern highways, their stones entombed beneath asphalt. Visible in the countryside, where stretches of original paving peek through weeds. Preserved in villages, where entire lanes follow Roman alignments. Lost beneath farmland, only visible via aerial photography. Accidentally found during road work or new construction. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle. For example, near Cagliari, archaeologists uncovered a Roman bridge still in use by a modern farmer. In Narni, parts of the original paving were found beneath the town square. At Spoleto, a curved section of road descends into a preserved Roman tunnel, its ceiling still blackened from ancient torch soot. The road is both there and not there, present in maps, memories, ruins, and rights of way. A name that survives. Even when forgotten, the name lived on. Road signs in modern Italy still read Via Flaminia. You'll find it stretching north from Rome through towns like Civita Castellana, Narni, and Foligno. Much of the SS3 highway, a state road, is built along the old route. Locals may not think of it as a Roman road. To them, it's just the road to town, the road to the post office, the road to the coast. But linguistically and geographically, it remains the same path, a spine of travel, worn into the land by 2,000 years of repetition. And so the road persists, not through preservation, but through continued use. The pilgrim's return. In the 21st century, pilgrimage has returned, not always religious, but spiritual, historical, or personal. Walking paths like the Via Francigena and Camino di Francesco intersect parts of the old Via Flaminia. Pilgrims, modern ones, walk these routes to experience slowness, heritage, or solitude. They carry guidebooks. Some walk for religion, others for health. Some want to escape their phones. Some want to feel the weight of the past beneath their feet. When they walk the Flaminian path, they may see old mile markers, their inscriptions fading. Roman paving, exposed in quiet woods. Medieval chapels, once roadside rest stops. Graffiti, both ancient and modern. The outline of the Apennines, unchanged by time. To them, the Via Flaminia is no longer a highway. It is a conversation with the past, told through footsteps. Roads shape us still. Even when hidden, roads shape geography. Towns remain where way stations once stood. Markets still gather where travelers used to stop. Roads influence property lines, drainage paths, and postal routes. In Rome itself, the Ponte Milvio still carries traffic. Cyclists and joggers cross it daily. It is now known more for lovers' padlocks than for emperors, but the stones beneath remain Roman. Every corner of the Via Flaminia echoes that paradox. A road built for conquest, reused for commerce, then forgotten, then walked again, and finally mapped into memory. It is not the only Roman road to follow this pattern, but few have done it so quietly, so completely, and with such persistence. A lesson in infrastructure. There is a lesson here not in the glory of Rome, but in the power of infrastructure. The Via Flaminia was not built to be admired, it was built to function. And because it functioned well, it remained useful for centuries. It adapted to new civilizations. It became invisible in daily life. And in doing so, it outlived emperors, wars, and dynasties. Its endurance is not due to splendor, but to simplicity. A straight line over land built with care and used without ceremony. That is perhaps the greatest legacy of Roman roads, quiet relevance. Final reflection. Today, a traveler might cross the Via Flaminia without knowing it. A school bus, a delivery van, a barefoot pilgrim, a Roman legionary all use the same path. Not because it is old, but because it still works. Scroll Story 6. The quiet power of papyrus, the bureaucratic life of a scroll. Before ink, before parchment, before the codex, there was papyrus. It is a material now relegated to museum displays and trivia questions. But for more than 2,000 years, papyrus was the backbone of bureaucracy, commerce, and communication from the banks of the Nile to the halls of Roman governance. It was not exciting, not romantic, but it was essential. Without it, there would have been no tax collection, no shipping records, no censuses, and no imperial decrees. This story is not about emperors or generals. It is about a piece of paper, one scroll among millions crafted from a river plant, inked by anonymous scribes, passed through calloused hands, filed in dusty archives, and ultimately left to rot in silence. In this section, we follow the making of papyrus, from the slow-growing stalks in Egypt's marshes to the tightly rolled scrolls stacked in chests, destined for bureaucrats who may never read them. The papyrus plant. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, grows naturally along the Nile River delta, thriving in the warm, shallow marshes. To the untrained eye, it appears like a tall green reed, with a burst of feathery stalks at the top. But in the ancient world, it was as valuable as timber. For the Egyptians and later the Greeks and Romans, papyrus was more than just a plant. It was a medium, the platform upon which all transactions, poetry, edicts, and inventory lists were built. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the Egyptians had already refined the technique for turning it into sheets. The process would remain virtually unchanged for centuries. Making the sheet. A scroll's life began in the papyrus workshops of Egypt, usually near the marshy banks of the Nile. The workers, often skilled slaves or state employees, would begin by harvesting the stalks. The process was methodical. cutting the stalks into lengths, usually about 30–40 cm. Peeling the outer rind, revealing the inner pith. Slicing the pith into thin strips. Laying the strips in 2 layers, one horizontal, one vertical. Pressing and drying the layered sheets under heavy weights. Polishing the sheet with a smooth stone or seashell. No glue was needed. The natural sap from the plant acted as an adhesive. The result was a pale yellow sheet, slightly rough to the touch with a fibrous texture. It was light, flexible, and easy to roll, but fragile in humidity and prone to tearing. Joining the scroll. A single sheet was rarely enough for a full document. Instead, sheets were glued edge to edge, forming a scroll called a volumen. Depending on its purpose, a scroll might contain anywhere from 5 to 30 or more sheets, producing a document up to several meters long when fully unrolled. Each joint was aligned carefully, so the vertical fibers continued uninterrupted, an important detail for ensuring smooth writing and rolling. The scroll was then rolled with the writing side facing inward, and sometimes stored in a leather or linen wrapper. For important documents, a wooden rod might be inserted for easier handling. Scribes and styles. Writing on papyrus was a skill in itself. Scribes used a reed pen, or calamus, dipped in black ink made from soot and gum. For titles or keywords, red ink, a rare luxury, was used sparingly. Roman documents often used cursive Latin, a fast, utilitarian script suited for ledgers, orders, and correspondence. For Greek documents, especially in Egypt, uncial or semi-uncial script was common. A scroll might contain a tax record, 3 modi of wheat collected from Lucius Marcius, farm plot 17. A military roster, cohort IV stationed at Thebes, 22 men present, 3 absent on leave. A shipping log, 1 amphora of garum exported to Neapolis. A census entry, household of Nikon, 4 persons, 1 goat, 2 jars of oil. These were not grand words, but they were vital to keeping the empire running. Storage and decay. Once written, scrolls were tied with linen cord and stored in clay jars, wooden chests, or cubbyholes in administrative buildings. Over time, moisture, mold, and vermin destroyed most of these documents. Scrolls were especially vulnerable to humidity, which caused the papyrus layers to delaminate. Rodents, who shredded the scrolls to make nests. Fire, which consumed entire archives in a matter of hours. Reuse, as blank sides were scraped clean and repurposed. As a result, very few scrolls survived except in rare dry climates, such as the Egyptian desert or sealed storage pits. Ironically, the documents most likely to survive were often boring ones, discarded tax records, account books, or personal letters never thought worth preserving. The scribe's day. Imagine the life of a municipal scribe in the Roman province of Aegyptus, around 150 CE. He begins his day at dawn in a small writing office. He has a wooden desk, a clay inkwell, several reed pens, and a pile of blank papyrus sheets stacked on a shelf. His tasks for the day include copying 3 new tax notices from the prefect, recording the arrival of goods at the river port, updating a scroll listing registered households, writing 2 receipts for land rent payments. He dips his pen, writes slowly with measured strokes, dries each sheet before rolling it. There is no drama, no conversation, just the soft scratch of reed on plant and the dull scent of old ink. This is history at its most mundane, but also its most real. A trade across the empire. Papyrus was not only made for local use, it was a massive export industry. Scrolls were shipped from Egypt across the Mediterranean, to Athens for administrative records, to Rome for senatorial correspondence, to Pompeii for personal libraries, to Londinium for provincial orders, to Ephesus for commercial inventories. Egypt's monopoly on papyrus made it a strategic asset. Later, during periods of political unrest, the supply of papyrus was sometimes restricted, forcing other regions to rely on parchment or wax tablets. Still, papyrus remained dominant for centuries. Ending thought. This section ends not with a dramatic climax, but with a question. What happens to a world built on fragile reeds when the scrolls decay, the ink fades, and no one remembers what was written? What is lost when the paper vanishes? The scroll in question is unremarkable. Its script is precise but unadorned. It records in dry language the allocation of wheat rations to a Roman military outpost near the town of Oxyrhynchus in the Egyptian province. Dated to the late 2nd century CE, it was written by an unknown scribe on a piece of papyrus that had already yellowed slightly in the arid heat. It was meant to be read once, perhaps twice. It served its function, to prove the grain was delivered. Then it was tied with linen cord, stored in a terracotta jar, and filed on a wooden shelf in a dimly lit administrative room. It would not be touched again for nearly 2 millennia. This is the story of what happened in the long silence between the usefulness of a scroll and its rediscovery, a journey that is as uneventful as it is quietly monumental. Where bureaucracy sleeps. Roman Egypt was an empire of paperwork. With hundreds of thousands of residents spread across towns, villages, and estates, administration required layers of documentation. Census rolls, updated every 14 years. Tax records, divided by land type, person, and region. Trade permits, market inspections, rental agreements. Births, deaths, and everything in between. Every town had a record office, usually overseen by a magistrate or imperial functionary. Documents were stored in jars or boxes and kept indefinitely, in case future audits or disputes arose. But unlike the grandeur of Rome's marble forums, these offices were modest mud brick buildings with clay floors, wooden doors, and shelves of fragile paper. They were pragmatic, not ceremonial. The scroll from our story was filed in one such place beneath others, marked with charcoal ink on its outer roll. Cohort provisions, year 6 of Antoninus Pius. Nothing about it stood out. It did not predict a war. It did not crown a king. It noted that 48 modi of wheat had been delivered to a garrison of 18 men and 2 officers. Then it waited. The scroll that didn't decay. Most papyrus scrolls didn't survive. They were eaten by time, insects, or carelessness. But some by accident or habit were placed in dry, sealed locations. In Egypt, this meant storage pits used for obsolete documents, rooms abandoned when buildings collapsed, jars sealed with wax or clay, rubble layers in desert outskirts. The scroll in our story was eventually moved, no one knows when or why, to a waste heap behind an administrative building outside Oxyrhynchus. This wasn't unusual. In late antiquity, Roman Egypt saw waves of administrative reform and urban decline. When offices closed or records were deemed redundant, scribes often dumped them in piles just beyond town. Rather than burn them, they buried them, an act of laziness or reverence. No one can say. It was this casual disposal that saved the scroll. The Oxyrhynchus dump. In the late 19th century, 2 British archaeologists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, arrived at Oxyrhynchus with an eye for forgotten paper. They knew that the city had been an important administrative hub. More importantly, they knew that Egypt's arid conditions made it the perfect preservation chamber for papyrus. Digging through what had once been a rubbish mound, they began to uncover tens of thousands of papyrus fragments. Some were literary treasures, lost plays of Menander, early Christian texts, fragments of Sappho. But the vast majority were mundane: tax receipts, land leases, account ledgers, weather reports, personal letters, complaints, and inventories. Our scroll was among them, crushed, stained, but legible. A second life in catalogs. After its discovery, the scroll was flattened and catalogued. Grenfell and Hunt, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of finds, developed a labeling system that assigned each document a number and description. The scroll was designated something like P. Oxy, 11,734, military provisions, Latin, 2nd CCE. It was sent to an archive in Oxford, where it joined others in cardboard boxes, waiting to be studied. And then it waited again. For decades, reading what wasn't meant to last. When the scroll was eventually read by a researcher, a paleographer interested in military provisioning, it was digitized, translated, and quietly published in a volume that circulated mainly among specialists. Its text read something like, in the year 6 of Antoninus Pius, wheat, Modi 48, delivered to the 2nd cohort stationed at Camp A, Oxyrhynchus, for the week ending calends of September. There were columns of numbers, a name possibly of the clerk, no signature, no mention of who authorized it. To most, it was uninteresting. But to historians, it filled a gap, a tiny one, yes, but real. It helped map supply routes. It confirmed troop placements. It gave weight to other fragments. In the world of papyrology, context is built slowly, sheet by sheet. Bureaucracy never sleeps, but it forgets. The Roman Empire's strength lay in its bureaucracy, a machine so complex and vast that no one person ever understood it completely. Every scroll, however dull, was part of that machine. Together they ensured taxes were paid, confirmed soldiers were fed, maintained grain quotas, prevented rebellion by sustaining order. When these records were lost, the machine stuttered. When they were ignored, it drifted into administrative blindness. And yet, when found centuries later, these same records became tools for modern understanding. The patina of boredom. There's a strange beauty in how boring details outlive the famous ones. While marble statues are looted or smashed, and royal decrees lost to fire, a scroll about grain deliveries survives in a desert mound. Not because it was loved, but because it was forgotten early enough to be preserved. In this way, boredom becomes protective. Our scroll did not aim for legacy. It aimed for accuracy. And in that quiet precision, it left a trace of the ordinary lives who made empires function. Ending thought. When we look at history through grand events, wars, coronations, revolutions, we miss the paper trails that held them together. What do we learn when we follow the uncelebrated scrolls instead? And if our own age's bureaucracy were buried tomorrow, what stories would someone read in a printed receipt, a spreadsheet, or a shipping manifest? All things end, even the most essential technologies. Papyrus scrolls once ruled the world of record-keeping, used from the palaces of pharaohs to the provincial tax offices of Rome. But like many infrastructures, their decline was not dramatic. It was slow, incremental, almost boring. In this final section, we trace how papyrus was gradually replaced by new materials and methods, how the scroll became outdated, and how that obsolescence reshaped the very structure of knowledge. Along the way, we reflect on what is gained and lost when a civilization changes the format of memory. Open book: the rise of the codex. The papyrus scroll was a triumph of its time, but it had limitations. It had to be unrolled, which made referencing specific sections slow. It was fragile in damp climates. It could only be written on one side. It was difficult to store in large quantities. As early as the 1st century CE, people began experimenting with an alternative, the codex. This was a bound format, individual sheets stacked and stitched along one edge, like a modern book. The earliest codices were made of parchment or vellum, animal skins scraped and stretched into durable, foldable writing surfaces. The codex format had several advantages. Both sides could be written on. It was easier to navigate, one could flip to a page, rather than scroll linearly. It stored compactly. It was more resistant to humidity and wear. At first, the codex was an oddity, sometimes viewed with suspicion. But by the 4th century CE, especially in Christian circles, it had become the dominant medium for serious texts. Papyrus scrolls, once ubiquitous, began to look dated. From reeds to sheep. Parchment wasn't new, it had existed in Pergamon and other regions centuries before. But as trade networks shifted and access to papyrus became less stable, the empire turned increasingly to animal skins for its documents. There were trade-offs. Papyrus was cheaper, lighter, and more readily available as long as Egypt was cooperative. Parchment was costlier, each sheet required the skin of a sheep, goat, or calf, but it was more durable. It could be folded, sewn, and lasted longer in European climates. Over time, papyrus was used mostly for routine documentation, receipts, letters, notices. Parchment was reserved for legal texts, religious manuscripts, and books. By the 6th or 7th century CE, papyrus use had significantly declined in most parts of the former Roman Empire, surviving only in certain Islamic administrations and monastic outposts. The scroll, too, began to vanish not with violence but with neglect. Books a change in the shape of memory. This shift from scroll to codex was not just technological, it was epistemological. It changed how people thought about knowledge. Scrolls were linear. You read them from start to finish, unwinding as you went. They encouraged narrative, sequence, and a kind of ceremonial use. Codices allowed rapid reference, cross-indexing, marginal notes, compilation of many texts in one volume. In short, codices supported study in a way scrolls never could. They helped transform monastic libraries, legal institutions, and eventually universities. As scholars say, the codex is not just a container, it's an idea. And papyrus, by being tied to scrolls, could not compete. Funeral, the forgotten millions. By the early medieval period, tens of millions of papyrus scrolls had existed, and almost all were gone. They were burned for firewood, destroyed by flood, mold, insects, recycled as mummy wrappings, scrubbed clean and reused, simply left to rot in collapsed buildings. Only a tiny fraction survives today, mostly from Egypt, where the dryness preserved them accidentally. These include contracts, petitions, edicts, letters, book fragments. Most are not beautiful, they are not epic, but they are honest windows into the minor mechanisms of vast empires. Card, the modern resurrection. In the 20th and 21st centuries, efforts to digitize papyrus fragments have given them a second life. Institutions like the Oxyrhynchus Papyri Project, the Leuven database of ancient books, and others have scanned, translated, and cataloged thousands of fragments, each one a thread in the tapestry of historical reconstruction. Some fragments are viewed only by a few researchers. Others are rediscovered by accident, identified through machine learning, infrared imaging, or citizen science projects. In some ways, these scrolls are now more accessible than ever, even though they spent most of their life buried or ignored. Their whispers have become part of our modern digital noise. Cyclone, a legacy of format. It's tempting to mourn the scroll as an obsolete medium, but perhaps it's more accurate to see it as a phase, a format suited to a certain kind of society, climate, and pace. Today, we live amid our own fragile media. Files stored on failing hard drives. Messages buried in obsolete apps. Documents in formats no one can open. What papyrus reminds us is this: format matters, not just for utility but for longevity. The tools we use to preserve knowledge shape which knowledge survives. The scrolls that endure are not the best written, they're the best protected. Final reflection. When you think of all the messages, receipts, and reports you've written today, what would someone learn from them in 2,000 years? If they were found in a heap of digital dust, would they seem boring? Or would they be the most honest records of how our world functioned?